Good morning and welcome to the Cloud Identity Summit 2014. Morning. I'm not actually sweating. This is salt water and sand. Anyone who is out there with me this morning, raise your hand. Let's hear it. Hoorah! Hoorah! Awesome. All right, we'll have photos of that tomorrow. We've got about 170 companies here today, and I just wanted to, let's see if I've got it up on the screen, start by saying this is the reason why we as the identity industry are here. So I just wanted to show a list of those names. If you're one of these companies, the enterprises that are deploying identity and identity management, I'd like to see your hands real quick. Thank you for being here. You're our reason for being. So 12 years ago, I had a vision. I was sitting on a sailboat in the Caribbean, bored out of my skull, blogging for the first time. This is when I used to take a floppy disk, 1.44, and boat it into the island, take a bike down to the center square, get to a little internet cafe, plug it in, dial up a modem. It was a lot of work to blog back then. But suffice it to say, I woke up one morning on the boat and realized that we were missing something on the internet, something really profound. And from that moment on, I started to see the world through a new lens. And it's been 12 years since I've been looking through the world in that new lens, a world that I believe will be secured and enabled through identity. So this is the way I now look at the world. Everything has an identity. When I heard this quote from Dan Hedrick last year, it was a profound quote, and it really kind of stopped me in my tracks. And you know, we've been using the quote at Ping now for probably the last year since we heard it, and we've developed a thesis around what's happening with enterprise security all around this quote. But suffice it to say, back when I got my first identity lens, if you will, 12 years ago. When we talked about the clouds, we were talking about the weather. When we were talking about our dumb phones, if you will, we didn't differentiate them as dumb phones because there wasn't smartphones. And when we talked about SaaS, that was something that our children gave us. So it was definitely a very different world back then. So why did Dan's statement, identity is the new perimeter, hit me as so profound? And what does identity is the new perimeter actually mean? So perimeters, as best as I can see, are everywhere, and they're really not going anywhere. So what does it mean that identity is the new perimeter? We seem to be crossing more boundaries more every day. We're busybodies. Online, we click here, we click there. You don't realize that you're crossing lots and lots of security domains. We do the same thing in the physical world. From an enterprise perspective, if you just kind of step back and say, what is the landscape of enterprise security and what is the role of the perimeter in the new enterprise security? And take a look at what happened. Starting around 2008 or so, we started to see commercial SaaS apps in the cloud arise. And today we've got about 16% of enterprise applications are consumed in the cloud with SaaS apps. Starting around 2010, the user followed their smartphone off the corporate network and off the corporate issued device into AT&T's network and Verizon's network on their own device. And now we sit on the cusp of this infrastructure or platform as a service where companies are now contemplating getting rid of their data centers or consolidating their data centers and starting to leverage this public infrastructure or private cloud infrastructure to get out of the data center business. And what does that do then for the concept that I will put my assets, my users, my devices, control my network inside of a firewall? And what does it mean actually, this whole concept of inside and outside? Clearly, the virtual perimeter of the enterprise is now changing. So I think that when you step back and talk about the role of identity in a world where the virtual perimeter is changing, identity has a pretty profound role. And I think that role is going to come along the lines of convenience while enabling security and allowing us to scale. Somewhere in the intersection of that trifecta, I see identity playing a very significant role. So how are we going to secure this new reality, and what are the underpinnings? What is the infrastructure if you abstract away all of the noise and you start looking at these decade-long trends and a shift in security and a shift in the way we think about identity management? And how do we do this without creating a nightmare for end users? Could this be the role of identity? Clearly, I think it is. And I think the role of identity is to enable what we're feeling and seeing and what's occurring in this reality of heterogeneity and a very distributed environment that we are now required to secure. So what's underneath all of this? What is this new future vision? And where does the convenience of security and end user usability, if you will, what is that intersection? Where does that intersection live? And so then it kind of struck me, this thing called tokens. And I don't come from a security background. 12 years ago, identity management wasn't a term. I wasn't in the enterprise security business. I do credit the fact that I didn't come from that background as one of the reasons why I think I was able to kind of look beyond the current reality, if you will, and envision a world as I felt it should operate. It's like a comment Phil Becker made to me many years ago. He says, science fiction movies awfully get it right, because the guys doing science fiction aren't worried about what's doable and not doable. They just design things the way they think they should be. And lo and behold, if you look at a lot of science fiction movies and roll forward sometimes 10, sometimes 20 years, they really do get it right. We're always kind of chasing that. So what are tokens? I typed tokens in Google and this is what I got. Not surprising. Probably one of our most valuable tokens, money. Makes sense after all. They're pervasive, they're highly regarded, they're designed to safeguard, this valuable asset that allows us to trade goods and services in a convenient and scalable manner. So convenience and portability, two kind of very profound elements of why we will exchange goods and services for something we can carry around in our pocket that's convenient and hand to other people. Obviously, it's trusted at scale, and we have domains of these tokens. Governments typically regulate these token types, if you will, within their boundaries. So if you take the concept of tokens and apply it to everything and every way that it interacts with our lives, clearly we have lots of different tokens. And we have so many, as a matter of fact, I would argue they've almost kind of become invisible. Like we deal with them and we don't realize really why we're dealing with them. And so the point of today's talk is just to kind of walk through some of my experiences with tokens and draw the parallel, the analogy from the physical world to the virtual world that we are now moving into. Because I do think that there's not only similarities, but I think it's very predictive as to where we're going. So in addition to using tokens for a common form of payment, tokens are used for identity and security. And it is absolutely pervasive. You're gonna see that here shortly. And I think of them really as almost the atomic unit, if you will, of our identity and access control infrastructure. They're used to identify things, secure things, both physical and virtual. So in a virtual world, tokens eliminate the need for us to always go back to an authoritative source to check every single time we want to do something. So from that perspective, tokens give us a means of kind of scaling this infrastructure where we can provide some security and access control, but not have to have a system where we're 100% connected all the time to something, either in the cloud or back at our systems. We can actually be, quote unquote, kind of offline, if you will, and still gain access and have this semblance of identity, if you will. So last year I talked about, this is my daughter Parker, and they help us with the family events. So some of you have heard this one before. We showed up to the show a couple of days early, and we do what we always do. We go back into the room where all the boxes arrive and the t-shirts and the backpacks. Well, we had this big pool party that we were planning. So we had a mound of hula hoops and bouncy balls and stuffed toys and pretty much everything. And she was 10 years old. She walks in, she completely ignores the group of toys, and she goes right to the center of the room. It was a big, messy room. She goes right to the badges. And we've got all the badges kind of alphabetically organized in big boxes all lined up. And she immediately starts thumbing through the badges. We hadn't said anything. She goes, "Where's my badge?" That's all she cared about. Where's my badge? Well, we had a badge for her, which is great. She picked up the badge. I clipped this picture, and it struck me, right? This was about being official. This was about her having an official identity. It was really profound. I almost forgot what it was like, you know what I mean, to be a child and not have any semblance that this was simply there to identify whether or not she could walk up to the meal counter or participate in the pool party. It wasn't about that for her. So tokens do make us official. And being official comes with privileges. Badges are a common form of tokens. They give us, as I said, special rights and privileges. If you bear this token, you can drive fast, you can run red lights, you have an ability to wear a gun publicly. So lots of rights come with that. You can denote, if you will, with tokens, you can put it on garb. In this particular case, this is an official form of clothing, if you will. This year what was funny is that my girls arrived and they saw the staff t-shirts and forget the badges. It was, do you have my size? Because all they really wanted was to be official with a staff shirt. So fortunately we had their size. So in addition to badges and special clothing, we have tokens that come in the form of pins and stripes and stars, and generally speaking, the more of these, the better, because they do amount to a certain stature, if you will, unless we're talking about this token reality, right? And we clearly have a growing number of domains, if you will, security zones that we need to protect. And this is an example of what we're living with in the physical world. Turns out the virtual world doesn't look too much different than that. Tokens can be simple. They can be a receipt displayed on a dash to denote that you have paid and are authorized to park your car in a certain spot. That spot is owned by somebody, and this is a method of ensuring that you pay for that. It can be a wristband that says you can go up to the all-you-can-eat buffet bar, and they're not gonna check you. You can have RFID tags inside the wristband so that they become machine readable just by holding them up to something. You can put a stamp on a hand to denote the fact that someone has checked your identification and that you're over 21 and you're allowed to drink. We put RFID chips in our animals to identify them if they're lost and get them back to the rightful owner. So speaking of identification, passports, as we know, are really one of the most official forms of identification document, one of the most recognized forms of identification documents. If you step back and say, what is an official form of identification document? Turns out governments and corporations mostly are the ones issuing these tokens to us. And you step back and say, why? Well, I guess they own most of the assets that they're trying to protect, whether they view those assets as people or country domains or buildings or corporate secrets. Unless we're talking about one of these, Bitcoin, right? A digital form of token that is issued by individuals, which makes this pretty darn disruptive. Pretty interesting. We'll get back to that later. So speaking of digital tokens, we have lots of digital tokens as well as we have lots of physical tokens. Here's an example of some. Most of these tokens are about securing virtual domains, networks, apps, servers. If you have them, you get in. If you don't have them, you don't get in. If they've been revoked, they don't have the right attribute, all of the characteristics of these digital tokens help us guard our virtual domains. And like keys, most of these tokens are designed to get you into one domain. Okay? Unless we're starting to talk about some of the cross-domain tokens, like OAuth and SAML and some of these new tokens that we're developing, they're specifically designed to take our identity and move it from one domain to another. Some tokens, like keys, have a really long lifespan. And we have some digital forms of keys that also have a long lifespan, perhaps much longer than they should have. I was just looking at that shirt that Paul put out, my first password, and thinking, gosh, I really don't want to put that on the shirt because 20 years later, it's outlived its use. So we can solve that We've created these one-time kind of physical instantiations of a one-time digital token. You press a button, you get a number. It helps us with our digital hygiene of those long-lived passwords that have long outlived their useful life. Problem with those is that why would I want a physical instantiation that gets me into one virtual domain, right? That paradigm, in my mind, simply doesn't scale. So what we're talking about, like security domains and why tokens at all, I discussed before, they largely exist to help us protect various security domains. And as I said before, the physical and the virtual worlds really kind of collide here if you step back and look at what's actually happening. So let's just kind of step back and take a look at that. Where are all the various security zones that live that we interact with day in and day out? I mean, clearly buildings are an instantiation of a security zone. If you think about it, streets are actually a security zone as well. To drive your car on the street, you need certain things, and it's protected, in many cases by the government. They're the ones that kind of regulate whether or not you have the right tokens to actually be driving on the street. In the virtual world, as I said before, our networks, our servers, our apps, our data, those are also protected with tokens, both physical and virtual. We'll get to that. So let me just kind of walk you through a Friday through a Monday of my life, where I had my camera with me, and pretty much every time I came across one of these physical instantiations, as well as the virtual instantiations of tokens, I just paused long enough to recognize what was going on. So start out like most. Very routine oriented. I leave for work about 7 o'clock in the morning. I get in my car. Turns out my car is a security domain, if you will. You have to have a token to get into my car. If you have my token, you can get into my car and you can drive my car. Okay? So simply bearing the token enables you access to that security domain. I put my car in a garage, another security zone. The garage is locked. There's another token that I use, a garage door opener, to open and close my garage. That's the second one. Again, if you're simply holding the token or bearing the token, you can get into my garage and access my car if you've got the second token. From there, I access the public roads. And here, I do need two different tokens to do that. I need an identification token. Turns out this token has, I think, a 10-year lifespan. It's issued by the government. And my car also has an identification and a registration that identifies how long that token is good for. And as long as both of these are in good standing, I'm legally able to access the road. Now, I could access the road without these being in legally good standing, but I could get in trouble. So from there, I go to work. Sometimes I get gas. And when I do, I use a payment token, commonly accepted payment token. This is a MasterCard. Now, what's interesting about this is that bearing the token isn't quite enough for me to buy gas here. I also have to know my zip code. And if I have my zip code, something that I know, and the token, then I can buy gas. Now, what's interesting about this is that I keep my personal card, a corporate card, my driver's license, and my phone together. Right? And about 2 weeks ago, I had it in my fanny pack, and I was motorcycling up out of Vail. I did about a 70-mile trek, and I came back and looked, and I had left my zipper undone, and my phone was gone. That's everything. My entire identity is gone. And what's interesting is that with my driver's license, they have my zip code. So a lot of my tokens were able to be used in that instantiation. So this is called presenter of token, or here it's not just enough to hold the token, to bear the token. You have to know something as well. And it's a form of trying to bind who the user is of the token with the rightful owner of that token. Okay, after driving to work, after leaving the gas station, I go to work. I enter another security domain, my parking lot. Here I've got to have my card key, as you guys know. The card key can be revoked in real time, not letting me into the security zone, if you will. I'm just going to move quickly through this so you guys get the point. I enter yet another security zone, the lobby. I move through the lobby. That's our office boundary, if you will. From there, I've got The same token that got me into the parking garage technically is the token the card key that I will put up next to the door to get into the building. So yet another security zone. Kind of move through here. It's 7 o'clock. There's not a lot of people to talk to, so I go right back to my office. And I enter yet another security zone. Here I use a physical key to get into my office. So, it's 7:15, and I've just accessed 6 physical security zones, not including the payment zone, if you want to call it that, my right to pay for gas, in just as many minutes. Typically what I do is open my computer, log onto the network, and from here I want to go to mail. And so I log on to Active Directory. That actually is a security zone now. I'm changing a password for a valid, it's being submitted to Active Directory. From there I'm getting back a SAML token, a cross-domain token, that allows me to get to a lot of my applications. Now it turns out these applications are all different security zones. Some of these are in the cloud, some of these are on my network. As you can see, I kind of denote which ones are local and which ones are in the cloud. If I click on Mail, I am now changing, in essence, my ping domain password token for a SAML token that moves across the network that's accepted by Google. And in that token are some attributes which identify who I am so that Google can connect me with the right mailbox. Now I'm going to go to Vancouver, so I see that I've got a check-in email coming to my box from United. I click on that, and after following the check-in process, by the way, moving now into United's virtual domain, I'm given back an opportunity for me to pick up another one-time token that gets delivered to my phone. And this is my boarding pass token. So you can kind of see that there. Good for one plane ride, okay, at the right time, date, and airline. Okay, so I take an Uber to the airport. What's so cool about Uber if you think about this? Using the mobile phone, location, they're tying my payment identity to an account on Uber, and I can get in and out of the Uber security domain and never do anything. Hold that thought, because the convenience of that scenario that makes us love Uber is exactly what I'm talking about when we think about identity as the new perimeter to allow us to secure things but move seamlessly throughout these various boundaries. Okay, baggage claim. First thing, here I pick up my family and notice that my daughter's photobombing every photo from here on forward. But here we've got a split token, right? Part of the token goes on the baggage, part of the token comes to us. If you have the other half of the token, they're matched through the numbers and the barcodes, then you are the rightful owner of that bag. We go here, got to check in the family, get the boarding passes for that. Here I submit a identification and I get back a boarding token, okay? Now here's what's interesting, and hold this thought. This machine is a security token service. Security token service. What does that mean? It means I'm putting in one token that it accepts, and it's giving back another token. And this machine sits at the border of 2 different security zones, if you will. The airport is a security zone. And to get into that zone, I have to have a certain type of physical token. Accepts one token, gives me back the token that I need. That concept holds true in our virtual worlds as well. So if you haven't thought about it, the airport line, this is DIA, is broken up actually into 2 security zones, right? All you have to do is flash your boarding pass, right? They're going to check you for status, make sure you get in the right line. They're going to, they glance at 10 feet, so I don't really know that they're looking at, are you supposed to be there right at that moment in time? But clearly, you have to have a boarding pass to get into this zone. But to move into zone 2, you've got to have more than bearer of token to get into that zone. You need to be the presenter of that token. And we have a policy enforcement point in the form of that gentleman who will take your one token, validate it, take a second valid form of identification, match those 2 together to see that the attributes on those tokens match. Your name. Okay? So I move through that. I go through the train. I get down to our terminal. What's the first thing you do? Well, you got 20 minutes or so. You check email. So check my email. Here, I'm taking my stored password that's in my email client, submitting it to Google to retrieve my mail. Okay, I need my boarding pass to get into the plane. I fly the plane 2.5 hours. I land yet in another security zone, a choke point, an airport. This is the choke point into Canada. Everything gets scrutinized coming through these choke points, much the same way we scrutinize things coming in and out of our networks anytime we have choke points. Now here's where it also got interesting. So that same fanny pack I told you that I dropped my wallet out of, thought I would have learned my lessons because this was 2 weeks earlier. I had the same fanny pack on thinking, this is my secure pouch I'm going to carry with me as I travel. Well, I left that one unzipped too. So apparently my passport fell out when I bent over getting out of my seat. So I get all the way down to the passport control, and I'm looking through this, and I'm like, oh, it's open. I've got no passport. No problem. Go to United counter, call up. They say, yep, we got your passport. We'll bring it back down. They bring it down, but I automatically get flagged into the Canada Border Patrol. So this was actually kind of interesting. I didn't know they had a TV show on this. The TV show is actually pretty fascinating. So we're sitting there in line, and there's probably 10, 15 people there. And I'm telling you, they are getting grilled. I mean, grilled. Why are you here? How long are you here? Why have you been back so many times? When are you going to leave? How much money are you bringing? Why do you have so much jewelry? Everything. Where'd you get the money to fly from Buenos Aires to get here? So it was entertaining, let's just say. But it cost me 90 minutes of my life. They looked at my passport. The guy comes back. I'm with my family. He goes, you're good to go. I didn't get the interrogation, but I did spend an hour and a half in Border Patrol. Take a taxi to my hotel. Pay with another token. Enter my hotel security zone. First thing I do is check in my baggage, another split token. Go to the counter, change my driver's license for a room key. Another security token service sits right there, it validates that. Go to my room, use my token, another security zone, temporary, key's only good for the number of days that I'm registered to stay. Go to my office, we've got a new office up there. Another building security, 2 different tokens, physical token to get in the door, card key to get into the office. Next day, I do this famous hike called the Grouse Grind. Any of you guys ever done that before? It's tough. It's tough. 1.8 miles is like 2,500 vertical feet. It feels like it's straight up. But here's what's interesting, right? You go into the parking lot down there and you normally just pay. But the gentleman that I was with said, no, don't worry. I've got this open road driver's license, driver frame. He goes, this parking lot accepts that frame as an acceptable form of payment. Like the dealership that issued it worked out a deal where you can park in different parking lots throughout town. I thought, that's pretty cool. Cross-domain token. Do the hike, get to the top, buy some tickets. Tickets are barcode readable. It gets me into the gondola security zone, takes me down the mountain, move pretty quick through this. Heading back to the airport, passport control, come back into the US security zone, move quickly through this, back in Denver, okay? Kind of like a Friday through Monday trip. So I didn't cover everything that I did in that, whatever it was, 80, 90-hour period of time. But suffice it to say, we crossed a lot of boundaries, physical boundaries, and those are the ones I just snapped pictures of. Each of them, used tokens to control access into the various security domain that I was entering. So here's kind of the net of all of this. Whether we realize it or not, how we secure our physical and virtual worlds are eerily similar. In the physical world, we use 1 token to access domains. By and large, we use 1 token per domain. But I think that we have an opportunity to do a lot better in the virtual world. I think we have an opportunity to create a common infrastructure enabled by standards, leveraging mobile and cloud, these new platforms that we have, to create a smarter, more seamless, yet still secure world, where our identity is the virtual perimeter allows us to move through these security zones, security boundaries, and still keep the convenience that we want. So I think of this as the foundation of the modern identity infrastructure. And our goal is to connect and secure everything, billions of individuals, billions of endpoints, both physical and virtual, and to enable security at true scale, but do so with the convenience. So you step back, it's 2014. We've seen lots of token types. What is the ultimate token? That's the next question that pops up. And so, is it something that you always have when you need it? It's easy to use and revoke. It's privacy enabling for the context of the setting that you're in. It's hard to steal, but easy to recover. Easy to use with new things. You can bind new things, both physical and virtual, to it. And it's accommodating of the security that is appropriate for the risk associated with the domain that we're getting into. That seems to me to be the ultimate token, if you will. So I asked my CTO team before, what's the ultimate token? And Pam Dingle and John Bradley come right back. And of course, Pam Dingle sent this photo. She goes, I think it's a reverse mullet. Okay, explain. She goes, well, it's all party in the front and business in the back. Okay, easy to use for end users. But under the covers, in the back, magically combines biometrics, devices, location, proximity, risk for the strong authentication. It correctly authorizes, and it does all of that invisibly. That would be the ultimate token. So when you look at it that way, and you look at the reality of our world and all these boundaries and security domains, all controlled by different people, right? Is it really possible that there is one token that works for all of this stuff? Or is it really a set of standards, a common infrastructure for managing tokens that's going to enable this identity as the new perimeter world that we want to build across all of our infrastructures, all of our devices, all our apps and networks, and all of our domains? So perhaps the foundations of the ultimate security, as I said, is a token platform. And maybe the foundations are actually already here. On the one hand, we have this super powerful computing platform in our pocket, most of the times with us. And it can do an awful lot of things. We can program it to do an awful lot of things. And on the other hand, we're now building a set of cloud services that we can connect everything up into. And if we think of that as a set of security token services that exchange tokens depending on where we're going and what we want to get into, and if we have an ability to display those tokens on our mobile phone and have our smartphone connect to everything around us when and how it should to let us into the appropriate things, to safeguard our assets that are close to us, might that be the ultimate token, if you will? And so I kind of think of the ultimate token platform as part mobile, part cloud, part open standards, a set of security token services, a device that can talk to everything both close and far from us with the mobile device. And then if you think about it, there's all of these deep assets that enterprises have, right? They need security token services too, to safeguard the entry of the appropriate users and devices into their networks and into their applications, right? From there, you can go out to the cloud, but here's the kicker of it all. For this world to work, we have to separate these components and allow them to talk in standardized ways. And this has really been the mission of the identity industry for probably a good part of the last decade. Developing the standards that allow these components to be somewhat autonomous, yet ultimately network together. So if you step back, what are we really doing in identity? We are networking identity. That's what's happening. We have lived with siloed, partitioned identity for 30 years. We're coming back around 30 years later, and we are networking identity. In the process of doing that, we are networking security, and we are enabling convenience at scale. So this is the world that I think we can build together, enabling all of us to get into the right things with security and convenience at true scale. It's a modern identity revolution. We stand on the heels of that. I want to be able to get into my stuff. When appropriate, I want to get into the corporate assets that the corporation wants to allow me to get into. I want to connect to all of my things, both physical and virtual. This is the modern identity revolution. And so, with that, thank you and welcome. Love having you guys all here, and let's have a great week. Thank you. So let me introduce our next speaker. Ben Kepes lives in a small town on the South Island of New Zealand. He consults and advises and invests in technology companies across the globe. He writes for Forbes and has been published in Read Write Rev, GigaOM, amongst others. Ben has 2 teenage sons and spends much of his time hiking in the mountains as much as possible. Ben's had more vocations than he can remember: firefighter, paramedic, electrician, company director. Today, Ben would like to challenge us to not think about identity today or tomorrow, but rather what it might look like in a hyper-connected future where everything is a part of the network. Please welcome Ben. Thank you.
Before I talk anything about identity, I actually want to say something completely unrelated to identity, but still really important. I spend kind of a third of my time traveling around the world, speaking at conferences, attending conferences, and I have to say this is the first time that I've been at a conference where I've gone down to dinner or I've gone to breakfast and there's been kids running around. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that Andre and the team and the organisers have really embraced the fact that we live in a world where we work, but we also have a life outside of our work. And so big ups to you guys for actually making family... It's awesome, because family is super important, and as you'll see from my talk, it's really important in what I do, and it's not an adjunct to our life, it's part of what we do. So as you heard, I come from New Zealand, so that means that you probably know 3 things: Lord of the Rings, Hobbits, Flight of the Conchords, and maybe if you follow music, Lord. Hopefully by the end of the talk you'll think that there's something else in New Zealand other than those things, although those things are kind of important as well. I have to say, Andre, I also missed the workout session this morning, but I went one better, and I went out at 3:30 and ran 13 miles. So there's the challenge for you for tomorrow morning. So I want to put a little bit of context around my talk today. As I said, I travel a bunch. I spend a third of the time away from New Zealand. I do a lot of consulting, investing, advising. But most of what I do is looking at the world, thinking how the world works, looking at the changes that we're going through, and mapping those changes, the broader economies, with the way organisations work, and looking at how technology can be an enabler for that change. You know, sometimes we look at how technology can disrupt existing organisations, or how existing organisations can avoid being disrupted. Most of what I do is thinking about that future and trying to bring it back to today, to the present. But really what's important, like I intimated before, is hanging out with my boys. This is us heading out on a hiking trip somewhere in New Zealand, and just to show that it wasn't a single gratuitous shot of me and my kids, here's another one for you. So the world is changing, and the balance is shifting, and that's what I want to talk about. There's a bunch of macro trends that are happening, and these are happening all around us, and we're kind of aware of them, but sometimes we see them in isolation from what we do all day, every day, which is technology. So organisations are being demanded to respond quicker, to be more agile, to be more innovative. Every organisation, every CIO, every CEO is saying to the people underneath them that you have to be able to do more, you have to innovate. Whereas in the old days, it was kind of okay to introduce a product and kind of sit back and watch the money roll in and just enjoy it. You know, at the end of the day, if you're building railroads, you don't have to innovate much. Well, today, if you're building railroads or modern equivalents, you are going to be disrupted. If it's not Uber with cabs, it's Airbnb with hotels. So you need to innovate, and you have to rapidly increase the agility. At the same time, and it's kind of counterintuitive, everyone's got less money to spend on this innovation. I don't think there's anyone in this room who would say, yes, my budget increases from year to year, and I've got more money to spend to do the same stuff. So there's this tension in that organisations are being told to do more, but they're being told to do more with less. Clearly, mobility is one of these big macro trends. If I think back to when I started travelling extensively for work, I guess 8 or 10 years ago, you know, what I could do on my mobile device, it was really limited. Today, the only thing that I don't do on a mobile device is to write long-form content. I mean, I know Mark Zuckerberg allegedly wrote the letter for the Facebook S1 on his mobile device, but he only did that because he could, and frankly, because he's a bit of a douchebag. Long form on a mobile device is kind of hard, but anything beyond that you can do. Remote working, clearly mobility enables it. You know, I guess I'm a great example. I live on a small farm in the middle of nowhere, and really in the middle of nowhere, like the nearest village, and when I say village, it's 100 people, is 3 miles away. And so I collaborate with people all around the world. I do webinars, I invest, I've got investments in companies in the US and in the UK. And so there's more and more people doing remote working. Clearly, when Marissa Mayer, when she took over as CEO of Yahoo, she, that's it, we're not going to do any remote working, everyone's going to be on campus. And everyone said, that's it, that's the end of remote working. Clearly, that isn't the case because people are doing it more and more. And going alongside that, we've got a plethora of different teams. I wrote a paper probably 20 years ago now when I was studying a management course, and it talked about what the organisation of the future would look like. And what I suggested that it would be very organic, that we would see in our lifetimes the end of these sort of monolithic corporations, these massive multi-100,000 person companies where frankly very little seems to get done other than pushing pieces of paper around. And I think the increase of teamwork, the increase of distributed teams is really seeing that. Clearly we still have some mega corporations out there, but more and more there's a balance of power moving, and there's a lot of power in the small and nimble players. Generational changes. Frankly, I get a little bit sick when someone shoves the sort of millennial thing down our throats. The fact of the matter is that when my kids go into the workforce, they're going to have to do what they're told, because if they don't, they'll be fired. But notwithstanding any of that, at some point in time, the millennials will enter the workforce, and they've grown up, bathed in bits, as the saying goes. They've grown up not knowing that you didn't have instant knowledge at your fingertips, not knowing that you could swipe through a world of possibilities, a world of connections. And so what that means for when they go into the workforce and when they're in leadership positions and when they're making decisions about technology and about teams, that's going to be pretty transformational. New funding models is an interesting one. Clearly the rise of crowdfunding, crowdsourcing changes the game in a lot of different ways. And so those are the macro trends. And there's some emergent technologies which go alongside that and enable these changes to happen. And so what are those? Cloud computing, obviously it was the buzzword from 10 years ago, so we're kind of over that, it's all very passé. But if we think about it, cloud has pretty much changed the world. We all spend a lot of our time in SaaS apps. Very few of us, I would suggest, or into the future anyway, will own our own on-premises infrastructure. We'll be using, cloud infrastructure from the likes of Amazon. 3D printing is an interesting one. Reducing the barriers to entry, allowing prototyping to happen rapidly. Some interesting use cases around the printing of prosthetics, medical 3D printing, rapid prototyping, CAD/CAM stuff. Also changes the landscape. Genomics is an interesting one. If you were to say, 10, 20 years ago, mapping the human genome, that was science fiction. It didn't happen. It was a pipe dream. It was completed a few years ago, and today for $1,000 you can map your own DNA. In the future, the fact of the matter is that in 10 years' time, it'll probably cost 50 cents. It will be done at birth, and that entire mapping will occur. And so what does that mean for identity? This is a technology change. This is a change in the landscape, but it all impacts upon identity. Nanotechnology is an interesting one. We all grew up reading science fiction about robots that would drive through our body and our bloodstream and do all these amazing things. Well, that's not science fiction anymore, that's science fact. And collaborative tools. I talked before about how teams work and mobile working and remote working. This whole world of collaborative tools, and I guess the best example, the quintessential example, is for anyone in this room who has collaboratively created a Google document in real time with 10 or 20 people around the world. Frankly, it's crazy, because everyone's deleting each other's work, and it's kind of, it tears your hair out. So I'm not saying that we've solved the issues around collaborative tools, but what I'm saying is that the rise of collaborative tools leads some opportunities and some questions around identity and what it means. Big data is another one. It's the buzzword du jour. Cloud's kind of gone out the side door. Big data's come in, and everyone is a predictive analytics platform. In my role as a writer for Forbes, I get dozens of pictures a day, and you'd be surprised just how you can spin big data into anything. Every vendor under the sun is a big data provider. Beyond the buzzwords, though, clearly big data raises some challenges in terms of identity, because it raises some nuances in terms of context. Where does that data exist? Who is that data about? Who does the data belong to? Who is accessing that data and leveraging the data? And the Internet of Things. Clearly the future, if you believe Gartner, in 2018, I believe, they predict there'll be 50 billion connected devices. With respect to anyone in the room who works for Gartner, the one thing that we can guarantee is that by 2018 there won't be 50 billion connected devices, because their predictions are invariably wrong. But that's one of the perils of being an analyst, I guess. But the fact of the matter is there is going to be a metric shit ton, and that's a technical term, of connected devices that aren't, in the past when we thought about devices, we thought about, I have a laptop, I have a desktop, I have a smartphone. Well, in the future, there's all these devices that aren't something that I have. They have no relation or just a nuanced relation to me as an individual, but they are still connected devices connected to this great big network. And so I want to talk about what I perceive of 3 stages of identity. I'm not an identity practitioner, so you're more than welcome to shoot me down and throw tomatoes, or if you come from the Southern Hemisphere, throw tomatoes. But this is kind of what I perceive has happened over time in the identity world. So the first kind of iteration of identity was very one-dimensional. I will say that it's very hard to Google search an image that represents one dimension. So this is the best I could come up with. But it was very much, at the end of the day, when computing first came about, we were dealing with white lab-coated technicians that were working on machines that were the size of this room and bigger. And so we didn't need to think about identity. We just needed to think about our punch card. We gave them our punch card, they fed it into the machine, and we got an answer. Even when we went to mainframes, it was still one-to-one. It was about asking a question and getting an answer. So there was no context. There was no context around the identity of the person connecting to that device, because that device was there for one thing. It was there to give an answer. It's kind of like, I guess, a food processor in your kitchen. It doesn't matter what you throw at it. It's about chopping things up. You don't need any context around that. It's about chopping. And so it was just about the individual entry of data and data egress. And so as we started using computers more and more, and as technology started being democratized and there was a computer on every desk, we moved to a new paradigm. And we sliced and diced a little bit more. And that paradigm recognised that there were different windows on the world. It recognised that when I'm using my smartphone, I might be using it as Ben Kepes, father of my sons, husband of my wife, my family, my personal life, or I could be using it as Ben Kepes, the consultant, the investor and advisor. And so what a really interesting thing has happened in recent years, which is a bunch of vendors have started building devices or software for devices that segments those devices into 2 worlds. I'm hypercritical about that approach, and I don't blame the vendors, because at the end of the day they're doing what CIOs demand of them. But it really doesn't answer the problem. This idea that you can segment your life rigidly into 2 discrete zones, and only 2 discrete zones, just doesn't work. Because at the end of the day, there's nuance. At the end of the day, there's some things that are absolutely completely related to my work life and some things that are absolutely completely related to my personal life. But there's other things that are in between. There's relationships that are in between. There's context that is in between. And so this idea of segmenting a device into two discrete worlds just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think that's something that's arisen because people see that there's nuance and there's context, and they strive to find ways to actually deliver upon that. They strive to find this balance. While Identity 2.0 kind of suggested or had this sort of illusory thought that there was balance between work and life, it's not realistic. I talk to people in large enterprises, and they're probably the closest, and the biggest enterprises are probably the closest to being able to segment their lives into two distinct parts. But if you believe, as I do, that those large, the largest enterprises are going to cease to exist sometime in the future, and everyone's going to be this strange kind of balance of working, for lots of different organisations, doing their own stuff, having their own projects, then balance is more than binary. And so prior identity approaches, why am I critical? Because it's really been about one key that fits one lock. I am a person, I have an identity, my identity fits that particular device, that particular paradigm, that particular context, and that's as far as you go. And my belief is that prior approaches towards identity have actually simply been about governance, risk and compliance. Everyone talks about identity being an enabler to access, but in fact most people actually want or see that identity is actually stopping people having access. Identity is about control, it's about reducing access through, from nefarious vectors rather than actually about giving contextual access. And so what's the opportunity? What do I want you to think about here? The interesting thing about an event like this is that it's great that practitioners can come and learn best practice because there are pressing problems for today. The reason that these, I talked before about the software that allows you to segment your mobile device into work and home. The reason that exists is because there is absolutely a pressing problem today with bring your own device and corporate data and needing to resolve that. And it's awesome at an event like this that you can think about things like that. But the magic thing about an event like this is that you can also spend some time thinking about what comes next. When those problems have been solved, when the challenges aren't around myself and my work life, myself and my personal life, but my challenges are around those 50 billion devices and how I interact with those and how those interact with me, that's the opportunity, and that's what I want you to think about over the next couple of days. So what does Identity 3 look like? Well, it's very organic. If you think about these 50 billion connected devices as a web, I as an individual am going to have an interaction, a connection, some sort of relationship with a huge number of those devices. That's not going to be as simple as me simply having authorization to access that data. It's going to be much more nuanced than that. It's going to be very organic. And so Identity 3 does look like a web. It looks very biological in nature. And the reason we need it is because already we're seeing use cases or problem cases around that stuff. A couple of weeks ago, Google had its Google I/O developer conference, and they announced Android for Auto, which everyone got really excited about. No one quite understands what it means yet. I think it means that you can get not your iTunes because it's Google. You can get your Google Play music to your automobile without having to wrangle discs or MP3 players, which frankly doesn't really shift the needle in a huge way in my mind. So with a lot of these things, the technology is starting to be there, but people aren't quite sure of the use case. I mean, even when it comes to Tesla, the most exciting thing people can do is hack your car and start it for you, or disable it for you. That doesn't really shift the needle. But clearly something's there. When these vehicles are connected, when all the systems within the vehicles are connected, that allows some magic to happen. And no, we don't know exactly what that magic's going to be, but we need to plan for it. We need to think about what identity means in that context. Again, the connected home, still pretty nascent. People, it's funny, we're only a few hours south of Silicon Valley, so we kind of are part of that sort of bubble where we get excited about something just because we can do it, regardless of whether there's actually any need or reason or use case for doing so. The fact that I can adjust the colour of my light bulbs via my iPhone, frankly, doesn't solve cancer. It doesn't even really solve many problems in my home, to be honest. But that's not to say that the connected home isn't a good thing. It is a great thing, but unfortunately we get focused on coloured light bulbs and sexy thermostats. And Nest's a great product and all, but it doesn't really shift the needle. And there's always this kind of imbalance in technology. Technology advances and then people work out what to do with it. And then when people need to do something else, technology needs to advance further. So the connected home, we don't know what it's going to do. There's kind of this talk around once your refrigerator's connected, it can do smart stuff like cook your dinner and work out your nutrition and throw out your rotting vegetables or whatever. No one's quite sure, but it's coming. It's funny, anyone who's been to Dreamforce, which is Salesforce's extravaganza, will know that Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, has a tendency to pull things out of his pockets. He's a pretty big chap and he's got a lot of pockets in his suit, which is pretty fortunate because he pulls a lot of things out. The past couple of years he's been talking about toothbrushes and talking about the connected toothbrush. For Salesforce they talk about the Internet of Customers. Other people call it the Internet of Things. Other people call it the Internet of Everything. Basically, you have to have your own little buzzword or term for that. But if you think about the toothbrush as a connected device, same kind of deal. No one knows exactly what for or why. I mean, at the end of the day, it's funny. My brother is a builder, and he's the least technological person I know. He's actually got a computer now, which is pretty revolutionary. But I always use him as my sort of my iron rod for working out whether something makes sense or not. And if I was to say to my brother, the new Philips Sonic toothbrush is IP enabled, well, I'd have to explain what IP enabled means first, of course. But if I explained that, his answer would be, well, why? What's the point? And frankly, we don't know. People talk about the fact that maybe our dentist can have insights into our brushing patterns and can give us advice or specific care, or maybe we can get a custom designed toothpaste that's specifically targeted to our brushing patterns. Frankly, no one knows. But the technology is there, and so the opportunity is for people to think about what the use cases are for those sorts of things. But from an identity perspective, that toothbrush, that's clearly a device. Multiple, it's connected to the internet. Multiple people use not the toothbrush head, the base station, or maybe the toothbrush head, depending on your personal budget at home. But at my home, we have separate toothbrush heads. So how does identity work for that? That's a device that has a relationship to me and to the other people in my household. It has a relationship, arguably, to my dentist. Potentially, it has a relationship to other health practitioners. I might be happy for anonymised data from that toothbrush to be used en masse with other people's data in order to make better toothbrushes or, do some health screening or whatever. So if you think about, the silly little toothbrush example in terms of identity, it opens up a whole bunch of questions around where do the relationships lie and what's the specific context for each party. And so what I'm saying is that all of these connected devices are examples of significant nuance in every relationship, and traditional approaches towards identity didn't handle nuance at all. The best they did was segment life into two buckets, and that doesn't really move the dial. Another good example, one of my buddies works for Bechtel. Bechtel's one of the biggest engineering construction firms in the world. They build monstrous airports and gas plants and things like that. And he was telling me when they do a concrete pour for one of these airports where they're pouring thousands of cubic yards of concrete at a time, they're now embedding sensors in with that concrete so that they can do stress testing, temperature, curing time, those sorts of things. And so all of these sensors, what relationship do they have to identity? If I'm a construction manager, project manager on one of those sites, clearly I want to be able to access those sensors. I want to be able to aggregate the data. I want to be able to access the applications that utilise that sensor data. But I guess my thesis is that all of those sensors have an identity of sorts, and identity as identity with a capital I. This event needs to think about what that actually means, because the next generation of identity providers are going to have to need to think about what this means, this sort of construct. Another really good example are these small water sensors that we're seeing being used in developing nations in the third world to do soil moisture levels. And that's another good example. I mean, clearly the farmer wants to have direct access to that data so he or she can determine when to irrigate, when to fertilise, these sorts of things. But again, like the toothbrush example, there's a lot of utility and a lot of value to providing that data en masse, to allowing the world to connect to that data, to those individual devices. And so again, what does that mean for identity? What identity does that device have? It's not about, the world isn't going to be about myself as an individual accessing applications. The world is going to be about myself as an individual having a relationship with devices, with connected devices. And more it's going to be about those devices having a relationship with other devices irrespective of me as an individual. When these devices talk to each other and I have no place in that process, what does that mean for identity? Because identity is kind of all tied up with individuals, with people. So, there's going to be lots and lots of sensors, and it's amazing where connected devices are turning up. Every industrial process that you can think of is using sensors, is using connected devices, and is putting that into the systems they use. This chap here, some in this room might know, used to be a technology executive, decided that there wasn't nearly enough money in that, so he's now making his living being purportedly the most connected person in the world. Frankly, sorry Chris if you're listening, but it's a little bit douchey. But so he goes all around the world telling people that he's wearing, at any one time, he's wearing 100 sensors on his person. I don't believe he actually is, but anyway. An interesting story, because he's also gone from 300 pounds down to something significantly less than 300 pounds, as you can see in the photo, by harnessing that data. And so this isn't a discussion, or this isn't a use case for the connected devices or the quantified self movement, but what it is a question, really, an open-ended question. What do all of those sensors that he wears, what relationship do they have in terms of identity? Clearly they are a part of his broader, wider being, and so there's a relationship between him and them. But there's lots of other parties and stakeholders here as well. The devices speak to each other, the devices speak to his health practitioner, the devices probably speak to a broader world who wants to harness that data. And so again, another use case, another opportunity, and another chance for us in this room to think about and conceptualise what that looks like in the future. So in closing off, if it wasn't already obvious, I've harped on it about it already for half an hour, but the future is going to be very, very nuanced. There's no blacks and whites in the future, it's all shades of grey. How identity looks isn't going to be binary. It's not going to be one-to-one. It's not going to be, one to a couple. It's going to be everything to everything. And we need to think about ways that we can build solutions and that we can build frameworks and we can build processes that actually allow for that. So I'd like you all to kind of go away and think about that. I'd like you to learn some stuff over the next couple of days that's going to help you today and tomorrow, but I'd also like you to think about what the world looks like when these 50 billion, give or take, however many percent Gartner gives you for errors of calculation, 50 billion connected devices are up and running, and we need to work with them. Thanks everyone, have a great couple of days.
All right, so I have an application for the toothbrush. We need a socially connected kid's toothbrush that applies peer pressure to get them to brush their teeth for X number of minutes. All right, so our next speaker is Mark Diodati. Mark is a 24-year veteran within the identity industry. He has a deployment background going back to 1996 when he deployed strong authentication for a major bank. He's collaborated with most of the Fortune 500 in their identity initiatives over that period of time. And don't hold this against him, Ben, but he spent 7 years as a research VP at Gartner. Today, Mark is the Cloud Identity Summit Conference Chair and also Technical Director with Ping CTO Office. And Mark will be focusing on distance and heterogeneity as it applies to the modern identity and its impact on authentication, how adaptive and mobile authentication are the only way out. Please welcome Mark.
So as I stand up here and I look across the audience, it's really something. This conference has become the epicenter of identity for 4 days. It's the biggest identity conference by far that's out there. I particularly feel a large sense of gratitude for all the speakers that have come here, that combination of industry people plus practitioners. If you're speaking at the conference, can you please stand up? Take a look around. These are the people that are sharing their expertise. I think they deserve a round of applause. You know, before I dig into modern identity a little bit, some of you are looking pretty haggard as I take a look out there. Yes, there are a few of you. By the way, apologies if I lose my voice a little bit. I think I sang one too many choruses of Let It Go at the social on Saturday. I figured let's talk a little bit about what you should be thinking about and how to survive CIS. We've got 99 sessions. And we honestly do have 99 sessions. We didn't try and make it a Jay-Z song, but we have 99 sessions. You had 48 possible workshops that you could attend this weekend on Saturday and Sunday, which worked out to 12 hours of workshops on Saturday and Sunday. But you're not done. We've got Monday and Tuesday, right? You have 60 remaining sessions that you can choose from, which means you'll pick 24. You're going to be in another 12 hours of intense identity sessions, cutting edge from industry practitioners and enterprise folks. Then you've got two more social events. I don't think we're going to have any more karaoke, right? That's a shame because, Andre, I was hoping to do that Back in Black duet with you. That'll have to wait, I think. Or maybe we'll have to find a karaoke bar somewhere to do that. You're welcome to attend. So 2 events, you've got all these things going on. You've got a lot of knowledge coming. You might be feeling like you're drinking from the fire hose a little bit, right? Well, I've got 2 things to tell you about that fire hose. The first is the fire hose is velvety, meaning that we've got the world's best speakers coming here, not only industry people, but practitioners who are going to give you the real world view of things. It's pretty cool. The second thing I would tell you about that fire hose is it's got a lot of diversity to it, from IoT to enterprise mobility management to governance to physical convergence to API and identity. My gosh, the list goes on. So with that in mind, I'd like to pass some guidance to you. I'm not a doctor, so don't sue me if I tell you to drink caffeine. Personally, I like to drink a lot of caffeine, but it's a yin and yang thing. You should be drinking some water also, maybe take your vitamins a little bit. Get some rest. Who here feels like they've gotten, or raise your hand if you think you're well rested. Isn't it? It's like this, it's just this great thing. Then you go home and it's quiet and you begin to absorb all these great ideas. Take good notes. We'll have presentations available for you after this, of course, but take some good notes. If you're like me, you sit in the audience and you absorb so much that it's hard to actually remember the things you want to take home with you. And take advantage of the weather we're having here in Monterey. It's a beautiful place. Get outside, Smell a little bit of the beautiful sea air out there. Clear your head. Let yourself reformulate where you want to be and get into a different place. And finally, make a friend. And I don't mean the Haight-Ashbury kind of make a friend or the Stephen Stills, if you can't be with the one you love you one you're with kind of friend. This is an incredible networking event, so it's partially about all the great information that we can share, but it's also an incredible place. If you see people attending sessions that you're attending, swap some cards. That will enable you to go back to your environment and have another touch point that you can continually keep in touch with to make things move forward. On to modern identity. Well, modern identity is composed of some things, right? We know that. Applications, services, user constituencies, and devices. There's no surprise there. So where's the modern aspect of it? There are two in my mind. There's heterogeneity, right? When we start taking a look at all the ways that we try and connect across the cloud, all the different devices that we have to connect, it's pretty well understood. But the second thing I say modern identity is characterized by is distance. And by distance, I mean span of control. That will be my shorthand for this presentation. When I talk about distance, I'm talking about the fact that as the modern identity world expands and we see great entropy, that we start to lose control as the distance increases. I'll give you some examples. I'm going to give you 4 specific examples. Across applications, for example. You may have applications that run in an infrastructure as a service environment, which means you have a pretty good level of control right down to disk space, databases, and so on. You might be doing platform as a service. You still have a broad degree of control, but you've lost some. And then finally you move to SaaS, and the beauty of SaaS, it's what it's supposed to be, is it's turnkey. But you've lost some ability to manage. There's some distance in this way. If you take a look at identity services, we have traditional IAM on premises, your AD world, your web access management systems, your provisioning systems. You also probably have an identity bridge, this thing that sits and overcomes the impedance mismatch between Identity 1.0 on-premises things and the 2.0 world of REST and JSON and SAML and OAuth. And then you move out and you go to IDaaS, Identity Management as a Service. And when we look at IDaaS, there are generally 2 categories of IDaaS that we take a look at, right? The first is single sign-on / strong auth, and the second market category is provisioning. But regardless of that, once you move into the IDaaS world, it's a turnkey solution. So you're not going to have as many options for customization. You're not going to have as many controls over the underlying infrastructure. That's okay, right? That's why we moved to IDaaS. We're tired of buying servers. We're tired of spending lots of money on operating systems. And we want to be able to grow, pay as we grow, right? We want to be elastic. So as our business grows up and down, we can do that. But we lose some control. Taking a look at also services, we have things like partner managed versus self-managed. And what I'm talking about here is you may be running a federated identity provider on premises, and then you're actually connecting to a partner site. And they're identity service providers, so it's SAML connections. But you have very little control over what happens on that service provider side of things. And if you're trying to do something like governance, and figure out entitlements and who has access to what, the great question of identity, you're really in a lot of trouble as we begin to distribute outward. The last 2 I'm going to focus on are users and devices. Take a look at the list of users. As we move up and right, we start to lose control. We have less ways we can mandate how they authenticate. And furthermore, there's a problem when we start taking a look at it that we have a problem with attributes as we talk about these different user constituencies. As you move upward, you start to have to incorporate more attribute sources to begin to build a picture of identity that actually works. So with employees, we can be very simple. Maybe just we pull all the data together. But if you want to do identity management for customers, there's so many bits of data coming in for you to be able to set authorization policies, maybe do some adaptive things, that it becomes much more complicated. And then finally, we have to take a look at devices, right? And this is just a high-level parse of devices. When we have users that talk about device anywhere access, this is what they're talking about. As we move up the stack in terms of the distance thing, we've got AD join, PCs and Macs, where you can apply Windows group policy, you can mandate any virus scans, and et cetera, et cetera. You move upward to corporate-owned, personally enabled devices, where you might have a little bit more control than BY and OD, but there's still a lot of heavy personalization that goes on. You move up, and then you've got BYOD devices. You might be able, through some crafty uses of enterprise mobility management, be able to implement some security controls. And then you move out into the consumer space, and it's Wild West, right? You have very little confidence for these users that are coming from these devices. The combination of users and device problems is causing problems for us in authentication. So before I start looking at modern identity within the context of authentication, I figured I'd talk about what matters within authentication to set a bit of a level. There are only 4 things that matter with authentication. It's really simple. The first one is application support. Does it work with the apps you need it to work? If the answer is no, you're not going to buy a solution, right? It doesn't make sense. Now, when we start talking about the modern identity era and we start thinking about federation and things like OAuth, we can begin to maximize utility of authentication systems because we can transition them, similar to what Andre was talking about, we can transition these things into broader applications. So application support is good. That's better. The other thing, and this is an important aspect to what I'm going to talk about, is identity assurance. It's the reason why we buy authentication. It's the confidence that you have that the person at the other end of that authentication is who they say they are. It's really that simple. Identity assurance has to be balanced against cost, of course. And the two of them come together to talk about risk, because you need to buy enough identity assurance. And it's going to cost you some money. You're trying to mitigate some risk. And so, as my friend Tony Soprano would say, I'm Italian, I'm half Italian. So any presentation I have is probably got to have something like forget about it, or Tony Soprano, or Mingia them peppers, forget about it. Anyways, you don't want to buy a $10,000 barn to protect a $5,000 horse. So there's this cost identity assurance thing that we're always working through. The last thing, of course, is usability. If the system becomes unusable, then your users won't adopt it. They'll find other ways around it. And usability is a huge concern, right? It brings us to my second thing about authentication. We have 2 eternal truths about authentication that really, I think collectively as an industry and as practitioners, drive us crazy. Here's the first eternal truth. If we take those 4 things that are important about authentication, assurance, cost, usability, the more identity assurance you need for riskier apps, the more you're going to piss off your users, right? And the more it costs you to do it. And of course, you have to overlay this idea of where your app's assurance requirement is. And that crosses the arrow. That's the point you're at. And I call it the sweet spot, but nobody really calls it the sweet spot, right? It's terrible. You have to spend lots of money and you impact your users terribly to get to some assurance level that helps you mitigate risk. It stinks, right? And another way that we can talk about this first eternal truth around cost and decreased usability is it just costs too much, period, right? There's a second eternal truth about identity and authentication. The first is that over time, we lose assurance levels. So you start at the beginning, you get a real good user right up front authenticating. Over time, we lose confidence, and therefore we don't have the same assurance levels that we had before. We lose assurance because users walk away from their workstations, there's malware, there's session takeover. This is a big problem, and really, essentially what we're saying is that authentication isn't good enough. We've got a problem with cost and usability. We also have a problem with duration, and it's just too expensive, it's not good enough. Perhaps it's time for us to reset expectations about this and not simply accept this as conventional wisdom and truth. I give you some personal examples of this. For me, I had to reset my expectations that I could not be a heavy metal guitar player anymore. That's me. Andre, I think that's a far better looking mullet than the one that was in that picture. You should have come talk to me. I could have got you a better one. But it wasn't for me. You know, the smell of tears, baby wipes, and vomit in a van just was not cutting it. It was just not for me. The second example I could give you is Christopher Walken, his character, Captain Coons in Pulp Fiction, just hangs on to this watch forever, right? Carries it around, overassesses the importance of a watch. You know, this watch, it's crazy. I carried this watch for you. Is that all I get for my, I've been working on that. There you go. So we have to reset expectations, and here's my thesis. Modern authentication, modern identity, it requires that we adopt adaptive and local biometric authentication. That's the only way we got out of this problem we've traditionally had of cost too much, isn't good enough. Now we've got modern identity making it incredibly worse. Things like social logins, to where we want to leverage social logins for access to high-risk applications in the enterprise. That's a modern identity problem. So we have to think about adopting these two specific technologies. I'm going to talk about them a little bit. When we first talk about adaptive authentication, let's talk a little bit about where it came from, right? And as Charles Darwin, of course, adapt or die. Or if you're a baseball player, this could be Billy Beane and the Oakland A's, adapt or die, you pick. It really got started with credit cards, and it was an emphasis on fraud detection, where we said, all right, we're going to monitor your transactions. If you're looking like you're buying something from somewhere else, then maybe that's risk, and we'll call you up. And something happened interesting about, let's say, 9 years ago, where the Federal Financial Institutions Examinations Council, the umbrella agency that controls the banking rules in the US, including for international banks that bank here in the US, mandated that single-factor authentication wasn't going to be sufficient. So we began to see adaptive techniques be adopted within the financial services world. And much of it is still there. We're starting to see adaptive move slowly into some of the use cases I'm going to describe. In fact, if you go out into the expo area, there are a few that can show you some instances of trying to move adaptive into the modern identity era. The way that adaptive works is it's always still going to be a primary authentication. We're always going to do a password typically. We may even do smart cards or one-time password devices or even SMS. It doesn't matter. It doesn't replace that. What it does do is it overlays a set of technologies around it. The first would be device identification. And here when I talk about device identification, I'm not talking about a heavy-duty hardware security module, PKI style. Yep, I'm pretty sure that that's the device I'm talking to. What I'm really talking about is this clientless thing that we do, where we take a look at the public attributes of a device. And I'm going to emphasize that word public because we're going to talk about what private attributes look like shortly. We take a look at the public attributes of the device and we make some decisions. We can see the IP address, we can see what software is running on it. We begin to do what's called fingerprinting. Can this help us raise assurance levels? Sure. Is it bulletproof? No. Nothing is bulletproof in authentication, right? We also have IP address blacklisting. So we take a look and we say, these are IP addresses from known botnets. Maybe we shouldn't allow transactions from them. And then geolocation, so if transactions are coming from North Korea, maybe that's something that should give us pause. And then finally, the last sort of major pillar within traditional authentication, adaptive authentication, would be behavioral, right? Where we say, if I bank Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and I do a $2 million funds transfer to North Korea, maybe that's something of interest. Maybe that's something we should talk about and see if we can catch it. Taking a look at our problem of not good enough and session duration, if we take primary authentication and we layer adaptive on top of it, not only at the beginning do we have better identity assurance, but over time we maintain a relatively parallel, a higher level of identity assurance throughout the duration. Now you notice we still haven't talked about solving a specific problem about duration over time, but it's better, right? Looking at the world of modern adaptive, taking what's being done in the financial services world, we're starting to see that happen. It gets a little more challenging though. When you take a look at applying adaptive technology through the modern identity world, you have our distance equation at the bottom again, and then degree of difficulty. So the more distance or entropy between your systems, the harder this is to do. And I'll give you some examples of this. The first one, apologies to everybody who's done adaptive in the financial services world or has traditional adaptive systems. There's a lot of stuff that's not in this diagram. Just know that I know that. We do an authentication, our primary authentication, passwords, whatever, and then we do the adaptive thing, device ID, looking at known IP addresses, et cetera, et cetera. This is a relatively closed loop system where you don't see much in terms of distance and heterogeneity. It's kind of monolithic. Again, this is a simplified diagram of it, but this should give you a flavor for it. Common use case, let's try and do adaptive across web access management. Let's try and make the authentication better into our WAM systems so that as we do SSO across the environment that we've got better assurance levels. And there are about 1,000 variations on how this works, but typically there's an authentication that occurs that's primary. Primary may occur over on the adaptive side, it may not. But regardless, you have the adaptive and primary authentication happening And then you have the WAM policy decision point, the policy server, and the adaptive server kind of talking to each other. It's either going to pass a risk score to the WAM system, like the risk score is 79. The WAM system can make a policy decision based upon that, or it's going to simply say yes or no, that's not the user. Now we start moving into the world of heterogeneity and distance, where we now, instead of having this closed loop system around authentication, we're actually going to use a cookie. It might be a proprietary third-party cookie, but you can start to see we have the heterogeneity thing happening. Maybe not so much distance, because maybe this is all within your, the confines of your on-premises environment. But we definitely start to see heterogeneity. Now we start to see distance if we take a look at using federation. Federation and adaptive works pretty similar to WAM, except the last thing that gets passed, let's say, is a SAML credential, something interoperable. Now, from right to left, adaptive server identity provider, that may be your environment, right? And so you have heterogeneity, but not a distance problem. But now we start to see the introduction of a distance problem because the service provider probably isn't yours, right? It's a partner's, it's maybe you're doing workforce to cloud style access. We're starting to see distance, and this gets more challenging because let's say we wanted to do more adaptive things at the service provider layer. That's out of our control. Let's follow this through to its logical conclusion. What about the API world? By definition, heterogeneous and distant, right? We have tokens that are flying around, and then we use an access token to get access to something, a resource server. These could be entirely separate parties. In many cases, they are. That's cool, but how do we make this better and improve the authentication and raise identity assurance across an API-style environment? That's a challenge. So on the right-hand side here, there's frequency. As we move up the stack, we can do more adaptive things. Lower in the stack, it takes less. We have less opportunity. So at runtime, when the client, or at admin time, when the client registers, we maybe apply some adaptive techniques there. That's good news, right? We can begin to apply them at the authorization server, the OpenID provider, when the user needs a token refresh. We can maybe apply some adaptive technology there. And then at the resource server, this may be the best place to apply adaptive technology because now the token's being continually presented at runtime that you can introduce some adaptive techniques. The problem with all of this, of course, is that these may be owned by completely different people. So it's very hard to apply adaptive across all of it. We've talked about one of the things that's going to save us in the modern identity era, and that's adaptive technology. Let's look quickly at mobile biometric technology. We have somehow ended up in this end state where most of our users carry smartphones that is it's a biometric reader, right? It's amazing. Voice, touch screen, camera, some cases fingerprint, some cases accelerometer. That's the thing in the upper right corner there. That's a shake weight. Has anybody ever seen the South Park episode with the shake weight? I'd go check it out if I were you. It's fascinating. But we have all these different capabilities within the mobile phone. And the mobile phone also helps us do enhanced adaptive stuff too, right? Where if you've got an application that's doing local biometric authentication on the device, you now have the capability to do enhanced device identification, right? How does that work? Because now you're looking at private parts of the phone. Prior device identification was about looking at the public things that was exposed from the device. If you have an app on the device, if the app has access to this data, right, and that's an if, you can start building adaptive technologies around their playlists or their contact lists. That's great if you're into identity assurance, right? We can raise the level up. But clearly we don't really have this technology out in the wild yet, and we haven't resolved the privacy issues associated with doing it. I think we will. We'll have to find some best practices, but we're really not there yet. So let's revisit the two eternal truths that we know about authentication. The first one being that it costs too much, impairs usability, and the second one being that it's just not good enough because it just fails over time. Here's the first one. If you take a look, we still have that cost and decreased usability thing happen at the bottom. Conventional, to get the same level of identity assurance is going to cost us more in user suffering and more in cost. We get a little better with mobile, right? Because we can now raise the assurance level without impacting usability too much. And then finally, if you apply mobile and adaptive, that's the best of all worlds because you now reach this assurance level that all your apps require, and you do it with less cost and less impact to the users. So to me, I like to look at it this way. If you kind of clear everything, do you want to be way out here with Cartman, where you're spending lots of money to get the identity assurance that you need, but you have usability problems, or you want to be Stan, right? Personally, I'd rather be Cartman. No, I want to be Stan. Let's visit that second eternal truth about the session problem, about duration and authentication not being good enough. We can see that conventional gets us, we see identity assurance drops pretty quickly. With mobile and adaptive, we can push it out farther. We kind of knew that, right? I showed you that already. But look at this part right here. The part between the conventional and the mobile and adaptive, what we've been able to do there is that we've been able to maintain identity assurance required by the application over time, longer. It helps us solve the duration problem. And that's kind of what we want. This is a topic I began talking about last year, this continuous authentication topic in the authentication track. And you're going to see more of it throughout the sessions at CIS for the next couple of days. But this is our best aspiration, isn't it? Isn't this what we really want? We want the ability to apply continuous authentication. Unfortunately, if you take a look, we're not even close to that yet. It's just not there. It's still a goal. It's a good goal. It's something we should be shooting for. But the ability to provide continuous adaptive authentication over time to maintain assurance levels that will work with the application, that decrease costs and enhance usability, we're not there yet. With that, I'd like to leave you with a couple of recommendations besides, staying hydrated and taking your vitamins and not over-singing at karaoke night. The first is you need to monitor adaptive. Adaptive technology in the financial services world has been around a long time. We're starting to see it move into enterprise kind of use cases and slowly beginning to see that in a modern identity use case. And I encourage you at the expo after the end of my presentation to go check out some things. There are some interesting things happening on the floor. But you have to monitor because these things are going to change really quickly as we have to apply these adaptive things to be able to do authentication in the modern identity era. So innovation is just going to have to happen, and it is. The second thing is to layer authentication techniques to raise assurance. We can take a primary authentication and we can apply adaptive to it, and then we can raise assurance levels as we need it. In other words, don't go out and buy a monolithic smart card contactless solution that gives you nearly bulletproof authentication when you don't need that all the time. You may need it only at certain times. It's much more cost-effective and usability providing to just buy what you need and then enhance as you need it with something like adaptive. So I deployed my first strong authentication system in 1995, 1996 at a very large bank processing facility. We processed for 5,100 banks. And I spent a lot of time working at RSA and CA in the authentication space. I covered authentication while I was at Gartner for 7 years. Ben, apologies about that. I won't make any predictions, however. This was the one, there are two things that people screw up when they do authentication. This is one of them. They don't plan for multiple authentication types. If you have a large user base, you can't be sure that they all have smartphones, for example. Or you can't be sure they're going to have smartphones every time they need to do an authentication. So you need to provide additional authentication types. Think of it as the 80-20 rule. What happens is, though, that organizations that don't plan for this, they really end up slitting their own throats and spending a lot of money, and then they get this system that doesn't quite work. Get your proofing right. What am I talking about when I talk about proofing? Does this make sense to everybody? The higher identity assurance level you have, maybe smart card is better than mobile. Maybe you have a quibble with mobile versus smart card, but certainly they're all better than password, right? That's sort of a conventional wisdom. This is the second biggest mistake I've seen in the, 18, 20 years of authentication deployments, is that we don't do the proofing right. What is proofing? Proofing is the stuff that you do when the user doesn't have the authentication system in hand. So have they been locked out of the system? How did you actually initialize that user identity and trust that you've bound their device appropriately? Do you have confidence before that primary authentication mechanism is in hand? Do you have enough confidence that you did that right? And I can tell you that there's one organization that comes to mind that I did some consulting with, Fortune 50. They spent an extraordinary amount of money deploying a stronger authentication solution. And they didn't do the proofing right. So they had very little confidence that the strong authentication mechanisms they had deployed were actually being used by the appropriate users. They didn't have the assurance problem settled. And it cost them 10 times more money to fix that problem than it did to actually do the initial deployment. And to kind of bring home the point about how much proofing matters, it's possible that you can make a smart card system that you spent all this money on give you less identity assurance than a password solution because you didn't do the proofing right. In other words, you can have a password-based system with proper identity proofing that'll win out on a smart card. It's that important that you get proofing right. Tune your engine. And when I talk about tuning, I'm talking about the fact as you move into the adaptive era, there's going to be some kind of risk analytic engine or rules and policy settings that you're going to have to spend more time on. Thinking about adaptive, one way to think about it is that it is a biometric system. It has false accept rates, has false reject rates. How do you manage those? Well, with any other classic biometric system, you begin to try and manage those down by changing the way that the system works. Same thing here. In the consumer world, it's really complicated. If you talk to any financial services organizations, and a bunch of you in here, that are doing adaptive, this is a huge problem. You have an army of people that sit there continually managing the risk analytics system to try and tune out false rejects, right? Because it hampers usability. Now, the small amount of enterprises that I've seen begin to use adaptive, it's a bit easier because you can apply more of a role and rule kind of policy. It's a little simpler to do adaptive, but it's still going to require more time than you think. With that, I leave you. After the session, we have some expo areas. I encourage you to take a look at our partners out there. They're doing some innovative things. And I really hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'm grateful that you came.